What's up, movie fans? Guys, so recently we got a brand new MCU movie in Black Panther: Wakanda Forever, and that marks 30 MCU movies across 4 phases, which is insane. So today I decided that I am going to give you guys my updated ranking of all 30 MCU movies. It's been a while since I've done an MCU ranking, so I figured I would do one today. Now, since there are so many of these movies, I concluded that there is no way I can do this video without splitting it into 2 parts. So today we're just talking about numbers 30 through 16, and in the next video we will talk about the top 15 best MCU movies, but for now we're talking about the bottom half of the list. So let's not waste any time, let's get straight into it. Number 30 is going to be Thor: The Dark World. For me, this has always been the most bland and forgettable movie in the entire MCU. I just really don't think Thor: The Dark World holds any meaning. It doesn't have anything interesting going on. Thor doesn't have a clear arc in this movie. Thor and Jane continue to have no chemistry. Malekith is a bland and boring villain. He has no motivation and his plan is confusing. A lot of the action sequences in this movie are surprisingly boring and uncreative. So really, the only thing in Thor: The Dark World that makes it worth watching is Tom Hiddleston's performance as Loki. Apart from that, this movie just doesn't have anything going for it. Number 29 is gonna be The Incredible Hulk. When I first watched this movie around 2 years ago, I was actually defending it. I said that I thought it was underrated. But upon rewatching it a few times, I have to retract that statement. The Incredible Hulk, it's almost as bland and forgettable as Thor: The Dark World. It only has a few redeeming qualities, including the fact that the action in this movie is actually pretty fun. It's just as destructive as you would expect Hulk action to be. General Ross is actually an underrated side villain. I really like him here. And Edward Norton has a pretty good performance as Bruce Banner. I think that he would have been fine had he returned past this point. But apart from that, this movie doesn't really have anything else going for it. Bruce just isn't that interesting of a character in this movie. It really feels like they only scratched the surface of what makes Bruce Banner an interesting character. This movie has the weirdest romance in the entire MCU. Bruce and Betty are just awkward together. Abomination is pretty forgettable here, and I honestly think I like him better in She-Hulk. He just had more personality in that show. And even though the action in this film is pretty great, the CGI has not aged well. Some of it looks terrible. So The Incredible Hulk, it has a few good things that bring it above Thor: The Dark World, but overall, this movie also has a lot of problems. Number 28 is Iron Man 2. Now, unlike the bottom 2 movies, Iron Man 2 isn't bland and forgettable, but I just straight up don't like this movie. I just think it has way too much going on, for one thing. There are 3 completely separate main plot lines, one about the military wanting Iron Man suits, one about Whiplash trying to kill Tony, and one about Tony's blood toxicity. And those 3 plot lines would be fine on their own, but together in one movie, they don't mesh well, and it just becomes a mess. And in order to make these plot lines work together, they have to make baffling decisions, such as making it so that for the entire second act of this movie, Tony thinks that Whiplash, the main villain of the movie, is dead. So he's not actively trying to stop Whiplash, and Whiplash isn't actively trying to kill Tony. So the entire middle of Iron Man 2 just has no urgency to it. Additionally, this movie does the worst thing that a sequel can possibly do, in my opinion, which is that it backtracks on Tony's arc from the first movie in order to make this movie's story work. Tony went through a lot of great character development in the first Iron Man, but here it feels like they removed all of the maturity that he gained in that movie. So there are a few things that I like about Iron Man 2. The action sequences in this movie are pretty memorable. I love the racetrack scene, Black Widow's hallway fight, the fight at the Stark Expo. A lot of that is really cool. I like Rhodey's origin as a hero. I like Natasha's introduction. And Tony, as always, Robert Downey Jr. is just really fun. But overall, Iron Man 2, I've just never been able to like this movie. Number 27 is Thor: Love and Thunder, one of the most recent MCU movies and one of the most disappointing. There are so many things about this movie that I love so much, but then there's also just so much that is frustrating to me. Starting with the things that I like about Love and Thunder, I think that Thor has a pretty good character arc here. He's kind of closed himself off emotionally from everybody after he's lost so many people who matter to him in previous movies. And throughout this movie, he kind of reestablishes this relationship with Jane and learns how to open up to her. I think that Jane is used very well here. Finally, after 2 movies, Chris Hemsworth and Natalie Portman actually have chemistry. I think some of the action sequences here are pretty cool, specifically the Shadow Realm sequence. That was one of the biggest standouts for me on rewatching this movie. And Gore the God Butcher is a fine villain. I wish that he was used more in this movie, but he's still good. With that being said, this movie has one huge problem that ruins so much of it, and that is tonal inconsistencies. This movie has one of the darkest stories in the whole MCU about Thor's trauma, about losing people in his life, about Jane's cancer, about Gore wanting revenge for his daughter's death, and yet this movie is told in the same comedic format that Ragnarok is told in. And as a result, it makes it hard to take a lot of these really serious elements seriously, since every 5 seconds you have Thor making some sort of joke, or you have these screaming goats, you have Zeus being just this over-the-top parody of Zeus. And it's just, there's so many things in this movie that just don't mesh well with the darker elements because they chose to tell this story in a goofy way. So Thor: Love and Thunder, it has some great elements with it, but it also has some frustrating problems. Number 26 is Avengers: Age of Ultron. This is a movie where the first few times I watched it, I actually quite liked this movie, but the more I've thought about it and the more I've watched it over time, Avengers: Age of Ultron just has not held up for me. Some of the best elements of this movie that made me actually like it, first off, I like the concept of Ultron. I like the concept of an Avenger accidentally creating something that causes so much death and destruction, and him dealing with the trauma of that. I like what they do with Hawkeye here, with his family. I think that this movie is finally what made Hawkeye interesting. I like new characters like Wanda and Vision. I like what they do with them here. I'm actually a defender of Bruce and Natasha's romance. I don't think it's as dumb as a lot of people make it out to be. And I actually particularly like what they do with Bruce, with him leaving Earth because he feels he's too dangerous for Natasha. So I like a lot of elements about Age of Ultron. Here's my problems. Even though I like the concept of Ultron and an Avenger struggling over the trauma of creating him, this movie doesn't really dive into it that much. It kind of saves the real exploration of Tony's guilt for Civil War. Additionally, this movie starts to plant the seeds of the Avengers falling apart, with Tony and Steve being a bit distrusting of each other. That is dived into more in Civil War. Thor has this entire subplot where he has these weird visions off on his own. Guess what? That's saved for exploration in Ragnarok and Infinity War. This movie is really just an extended trailer for future MCU movies. It doesn't dive into a lot of its concepts on its own. It saves it for its follow-ups. And I think that ruins a lot of this movie and what it was trying to do. Also, Ultron is just so disappointing in this movie. He's supposed to be this really creepy, threatening villain, but he has way too much personality for me to really take him seriously and be scared of him. So overall, Avengers Age of Ultron, this is another movie that had some great concepts, but there were a lot of things holding it down. The bottom 5 movies on this list, I would probably give all of the movies that we've talked about so far bad scores. I think that all of them have a lot of elements about them that just really hold them down, and I don't really like them that much. With that being said, everything from 25 to number 1, I like. I would give every movie that we are now going into a 6 out of 10 or higher, and that is a good score for me. So these bottom 5 movies, I don't like that much. Top 25, we're getting into the good ones. So number 25 is going to be Thor. This is a movie where if you don't like it, I can completely understand that. I didn't like this movie for the longest time. This movie's second act is just incredibly boring and uneventful. This is definitely not the MCU movie you want to watch if you want to be entertained. And like I've said before, Chris Hemsworth and Natalie Portman in the first 2 Thor movies just had no chemistry. And this entire movie kind of revolves around you buying into their romance. So there's a lot of elements with Thor that are a bit iffy. With that being said, I personally think that this movie is redeemable because Thor and Loki have great character arcs here. Thor has this interesting arc where he's this selfish, arrogant, basically, in Asgardian logic, he's a teenager, he's this selfish, arrogant teenager, and then throughout the movie, he kind of becomes humbled after falling in love with Jane and having to live without his powers. He learns the value of sacrifice, and he's willing to sacrifice things in the final battle of this movie. I really liked what they did with Thor. And then with Loki, he is just a great villain here, where he has just felt overshadowed by Thor his entire life, and he's willing to go to these incredibly drastic measures in order to gain Odin's favor. So I really like what they did with Thor and Loki here, and that really carried this movie for me. Number 24, Captain Marvel. This is another movie where if you don't like it, I get it. Captain Marvel has one huge problem, and that is the fact that this movie's themes and its storyline do not fit its protagonist. This movie's main plotline is all about everybody telling Carol that she needs to keep her emotions in check because they're trying to manipulate her. And then later in the movie, she realizes that they're trying to manipulate her, and she lets all of her emotions out, and she, gains her full power and her true potential because of that. Okay, that's a good story arc. Slight problem. Carol has barely any emotion in this movie. She's basically just snarky, and that's it. She's just snarky and arrogant. She has no other emotions, and so it's hard to buy into that main plot line. With that being said, I like a lot of elements of Captain Marvel, and I don't really get why this movie gets as much hate as it does. Carol is a fun protagonist. She's fun to follow. Her character arc is flawed, but she's a fun character to follow throughout the movie. Nick Fury is also very fun here. It's like this younger, more laid back version of him, and Samuel L. Jackson, you can tell he's having a blast. The Skrulls are interesting. I really like the character of Talos. And the plot twist in this movie revolving around the Kree and the Skrulls, one of my favorite MCU plot twists. I still remember I was shocked when I saw that in theaters. So I like a lot of elements of Captain Marvel, and I think that this movie is overhated. Number 23, Ant-Man and the Wasp. Now, once again, we're in this section of the list where if you don't like these movies, I get it. Ant-Man and the Wasp has a very small-scale MacGuffin story that's kind of meant to be a lot more laid back and fun. And so I understand if a lot of other people might want this movie to be a lot more complex than it is. But overall, I think that Ant-Man and the Wasp is a very fun movie. This movie isn't trying to be the biggest, most complex movie out there. It's just trying to be this simple, fun distraction from the craziness of the MCU. And I like that. There's a lot of really funny moments here. This movie really takes advantage of how creative the shrinking action can be to create some of the coolest action sequences in the MCU. Obviously, Paul Rudd is very fun here. Hope wasn't as interesting here as she was in Ant-Man, which was kind of disappointing since, she's supposed to be the co-star of this movie. But still, I like Scott and Hope together. I just overall really have fun with Ant-Man and the Wasp. But this movie is a lot more simple and less complex than a lot of other MCU movies. So I get if you don't like it. Number 22, Eternals. This is another movie where I get it if you do not like it. But I think that this movie is redeemable. Yes, the movie is overly ambitious. That is entirely true. The movie has way too many characters and plot lines, and a lot of it feels like wasted potential because since there are so many characters and plot lines, they weren't able to dive into them as much as I would have liked for them to be able to. The deviants feel particularly wasted by the end of the film. However, I think that this movie has a really interesting theme, and the way that it ties the characters into that theme is really interesting. Eternals has this plot line about the Celestials trying to destroy Earth to create a new Celestial in order to defend several other planets in the universe. So essentially, the Celestials are planning on sacrificing billions of people in order to help trillions of other people out there in the universe. And the movie kind of has this interesting discussion of, is that valid? Should they be doing that? And it has all of the characters being conflicted on that. You have some Eternals that decide, yes, it is okay for them to do that, and they want to defend the Celestial that's being born from the Earth's core. You have some that have fallen in love with humanity and don't want it to be destroyed. And you have a few, one Kingo who just decides that he cannot side with either side, so he just leaves. I think that that's interesting, the dynamic that they have all these Eternals in, and the way that they use this story to have this conflict between them. Number 21 is Black Widow. Now, in contrast to some of the other movies that we've been talking about, I legitimately do not get why people hate Black Widow so much. This is the first movie on this list where if you don't like it, I still don't get it. Yes, this movie has problems. This movie should have come out during Phase 3. it just doesn't hold that much meaning in Phase 4 after Natasha has already died and the Avengers have reformed. Taskmaster and Dreykov are terrible villains, and they hold down this movie a lot. And the third act does go a little bit over the top compared to the rest of the movie. But with that being said, the main storyline of this movie is really interesting. You see a lot more of Natasha's past and the terrible things that she did in the past. And you see her with, like, this family that she had, and they've all made mistakes in the past, they've all let each other down in the past, and they're all trying to learn how to apologize to and forgive each other. And I just think that that was really interesting. I really like the family dynamic in Black Widow. It led to some really compelling scenes. Some of the new characters in this movie, Red Guardian and Yelena in particular, are just scene stealers. I really like them. And I think that a lot of the action in Black Widow is actually pretty cool. I love a lot of the fights with Taskmaster, like the bridge fight in the opening. I love the prison break fight. I just think that Black Widow is a very overhated movie. Number 20 is Ant-Man. Just like Ant-Man and the Wasp, the first Ant-Man is kind of a turn your brain off and just kind of have fun type movie. This movie isn't the most complex thing in the world. It's just supposed to be fun. It's a very funny movie. Obviously, once again, Paul Rudd, incredibly fun lead. I think that the heist element of this movie is really cool. I love when movies have, like, these intricate, elaborate plans that, like, have to take place over the course of the story. I really like those types of movies, so I like how they do it here. I like the shrinking action. The fight on the Thomas the Tank Engine train is still absolutely hilarious. However, this movie actually has some more complexity to it than Ant-Man and the Wasp, which brings it higher than Ant-Man and the Wasp. This movie actually has, like, some interesting stuff going on with Scott about him having made mistakes in the past and him wanting a second chance to be a father. It has some interesting things with the relationship between Hank and Hope. And I just think that a lot of those more complex elements brought it a bit higher on this list than its sequel. Few problems with this movie. I think that some of the elements with Hank and Hope's relationship, even though it's very interesting, it's kind of rushed. In the middle section of this movie, they just go way too fast between the two of them mending their relationship. And I also think that the villain of Ant-Man is kind of boring. Apart from that, Ant-Man's a very fun movie. Number 19 is Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. Shang-Chi has to be the most frustrating movie for me to place on this entire list because I love so much about it. But there's one element that just ruins so much of this movie. Some of the things that I love about Shang-Chi, the action sequences in this movie are so strong, they're so well choreographed, they're so entertaining. Shang-Chi has some of the best action in the entire MCU. Wenwu is a great villain. He's incredibly threatening, and he has this great, like, threatening screen presence, but you also get where he's coming from. He has a strong motivation, and I think that Shang-Chi's a pretty fun protagonist. I especially love his interactions with Katie, but there are problems with Shang-Chi that hold this movie down. Shang-Chi just does not have a clear arc in this movie. By the end of the movie, I feel like he didn't change at all. He didn't learn any big lessons. He is an underdeveloped character who does not have an arc. And as a result, I find Shang-Chi to be a much less strong movie than a lot of other movies on this list because I just don't think that Shang-Chi has a clear arc throughout the movie, and the themes of this movie are also very confusing. It has a clear theme about family, but I don't understand what it's trying to say about family. It doesn't make its themes or its character arcs clear. So I think that there are some powerful moments in Shang-Chi. Like I said, it has great action sequences, but this movie's story has a lot of problems. Number 18 is Spider-Man Far From Home. Just like Shang-Chi, I think this is a movie with a lot of very strong elements, but also with a lot of problems. I really like Peter's arc. I really like his trauma over Tony's death and the way that he recovers throughout the movie. I just think that his arc here is very strong. I like Mysterio as a villain. He's not one of my favorite MCU villains, but he's a good villain. I think he has a pretty good motivation, and he's just a pretty good villain. I like Peter and MJ's relationship and the way that they establish that foundation here. I think it gets stronger in No Way Home, but it's still good here. And I like the illusion sequences in this movie and the way that they take advantage of Mysterio's powers to create just a lot of really creative action sequences. But my problems with Far From Home are the fact that this movie, kind of like Iron Man 2, feels like it backtracks on Peter's character arc. Spider-Man Homecoming was all about him kind of stepping out of the shadow of Iron Man, realizing he doesn't need to prove himself to Iron Man, and kind of becoming his own hero. Far From Home is about him stepping out of the shadow of Iron Man, realizing he doesn't need to prove that he's as good as Iron Man, and becoming his own hero. They do the exact same arc here, basically. And so that's kind of annoying. It's not as bad as what Iron Man 2 does, but it's still annoying. I think that Mysterio's plan needed to be much clearer here. It has a lot of confusing elements to it. And I think that the Edith glasses just don't make sense. When did Tony create them? When did he give them to Nick Fury? Why was he planning on giving them to Peter, even though Peter was dead for 5 years? It just raises a lot of questions. Number 17 is Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. This is a movie where, once again, if you don't like it, I kind of get it. But I really like what they did with Multiverse of Madness. This movie, I personally think, lives up to its title. They don't go to a lot of universes within this movie, but this movie does go absolutely insane with a lot of these multiversal concepts. It's a lot more campy than other MCU movies. Sam Raimi has a very unique style that I think is very enjoyable here. It makes it stand out from the rest of the MCU. I think that Wanda is a pretty terrifying villain. I do think that her arc also backtracks a little bit from the development that she got in WandaVision, but she's still a very interesting and terrifying villain. But the best element of Multiverse of Madness for me has to be what they do with Doctor Strange. In all of these other movies with Doctor Strange, he's very arrogant, and he always feels like, since he is so skilled, he always needs to be the one with the authority to make tough decisions. He has the authority to mess with time to defeat Dormammu. He has the authority to give Thanos the Time Stone. He has the authority to send all the multiversal villains back to their universes to die. But in this movie, he sees alternate versions of himself, and he realizes from them what taking those decisions into your own hands, what that can do, the consequences it has on the multiverse. And he realizes that he needs to stop making those decisions on behalf of everyone in the world, because it's dangerous and it has consequences. And so I think what they did with Strange here was very interesting. This movie does have a few problems. I think that the pacing of this movie feels incredibly off. But overall, Multiverse of Madness, I think, is a lot better than a lot of people say it is. Number 16, the top of this first part of the list. Obviously, there's a second part with 15 more movies. This video is already insanely long. You can see why I split it into 2 parts. So this is the top of my bottom half of the list. Number 16 is going to be Iron Man 3. Hear me out here. A lot of people hate Iron Man 3, but I think that I and a lot of other people have been too harsh to this movie. Yes, this movie does have one terrible element, and that is the Mandarin twist. They took a classic Iron Man villain, had a twist where it turns out he's just some random guy, and then they replaced him with a much less interesting villain, and that's very disappointing. And so I think that throws a lot of people off from Iron Man 3, but I think that if you manage to get past that, Iron Man 3 is a really good movie. It's a lot more unique than a lot of other movies in the MCU, like Multiverse of Madness. This is a lot less of a superhero movie and more of a grounded action movie. You have a lot of Tony fighting without his suit, and I like that. I also think that this movie has one of the most fun Robert Downey Jr. performances. This movie has some of his best moments, and I especially like his interactions with the kid. They're just really fun. I also like a lot of action in this movie. The human chain sequence, Tony fighting at the mansion without his suit, using all these gadgets he created, the final battle where you see all of the suits in action. A lot of great action here. But the best part of Iron Man 3 is Tony's character arc, where after the events of the Avengers, he's suffering from PTSD, he's mass-producing suits as a coping mechanism. And then throughout the course of the movie, he realizes that he doesn't need to create all of these suits to protect the people he loves. He can just be Tony Stark, and that's enough. And that's one of my favorite Tony character arcs in the whole MCU. So I get why a lot of people don't like Iron Man 3, but I think that this movie is incredibly overhated. So that was an incredibly long first part. We are not done yet. Honestly, seeing how long this video made it to, I'm honestly thinking that this video might be over an hour when you combine the 2 parts. But overall, that's my bottom half of my MCU ranking. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, leave a like and subscribe. And part 2's coming soon. See ya, movie fans.